So again, I'm April Wobst. I'm the Restoration Program Manager at APCC. And I'm going to steal a little bit because for those who know me, I'm a planner. So I've planned ahead a little bit on this. Last week, I was attending the Nui Pick Non-Point Source Conference, which was very focused on some of the other work we do on stormwater management, as well as septic and agricultural practices. And then sitting here today thinking about the projects we're working on here and some of the restoration with salt marsh restoration, river and bog restoration. A lot of what we talk about and hear about is the partnerships, evidenced by the group of us sitting here who've all worked on projects together, Chris and I working on projects together, and community engagement as being two important pieces to getting restoration projects done. The partners that we work with, many people here in this room, I think one of the things that makes those work is the fact that we know each other and work together either individually as organizations over a long period of time. And with that, we've developed a sense of trust. Like we know who we're working with, we know what we can get done together. And one of the things that is a challenge, particularly with some of these larger habitat restoration projects, is with that community engagement, you're starting sometimes as an organization working with a community where you have to build that trust. And some of the early projects, well, I'll say maybe we were fortunate on some of like the Parker's River Restoration Project, which was largely, town-owned property, or the Child's River Restoration, where we worked with the Falmouth Rod and Gun Club, and they owned or leased a lot of that land. That's not always the case with our wetlands. Our wetlands sometimes are privately loaned. And so a lot of the projects that we're working on now, it's not just one owner or a municipality or public land, but a lot of private land. So that community engagement piece and that partnership and building of that trust is so much more important. And Jason, the chief, Buddy, we're working with them and Talia on some projects in Mashpee right now. And Jason spoke to some of that community engagement that we're doing there. And it's just the beginning of that. We're working on building up that trust. What we do after what we've heard from those 80 members of the tribe attending that is what's most important. And so I think taking that forward, some of the last discussion we had in this room on dredging and how we take forward permitting, and when we're looking at these new restoration techniques of ditch remediation and runneling, thin layer placement, or even some of what we're doing in river and bog restoration or with eelgrass restoration, those areas that are newer, we want to build that trust with the agencies as well. And there are ongoing discussions that were kind of alluded to with DEP and with those agencies to help streamline that permitting. But I think, I'd ask that we work together to kind of build that trust and understand that the experts in this room, the experts working on these projects and working with DEP and the other regulatory agencies, like we're all reaching to achieve the same goal. Through some of the trainings and stuff I've done with Webner and others in the past, I feel like I've learned about myself. I'm kind of one of those, and maybe what I like to think is a good balance between like get it done and get it right. And I think those are an important piece both to the community engagement and to projects. And if Tana Marie's in the room, she's been talking to us all along with our community engagement. It takes time, and that time is important. And but we also have funding goals and timelines on our projects. But I really truly mean it. I think we're really in that point of trying to find the right balance of get it done, but get it right.
Thank you very much, April. Could we hear a municipal perspective on something that you've taken away from today that you'll apply in your work? Maybe a specific example?
Pass it down, sure. So hi, I'm Chris Miller from Brewster, and as I was sitting in the last couple of sessions about the thin layer deposition and some of the changes in permitting that's going to allow this, I was very encouraged. I think back to a project I did with the Cape Cod Conservation District and with APCC and some federal partners on a culvert restoration project. It really was a salt marsh restoration project. We have Route 6A running along that kind of bisects part of the salt marsh off of Cape Cod Bay. And it just ran right through the marsh. And on one side of the marsh, the elevation was almost a foot lower than the ocean side of the marsh. So at that time, there was no way for us to fix that problem. If I was doing that project today, 10 or 15 years later, I think that would be part of the discussion, and that would be a very valuable thing for us to look at.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Martha? Similar question. Is there something in the next year you feel like you can use something from today to implement? There's a little switch. Yeah. I think.
Can you hear me?
No.
Here, I'll trade you. Thanks, Kristen. I'm Martha Craig. I'm the program manager at the Cape Cod Conservation District. We partner with all 15 towns on the Cape, so we do work with Chris and Tom and many others in the room here. And I've heard so much great information. April, you did a good job summarizing a lot of that. I think that one thing that I'd like to try and implement more in our projects is aspects of the new biodiversity plan. I see a lot of room there and encouragement. I'm happy too about trying to streamline the permitting process, which we know can be not only time consuming, but quite costly at times. So I think streamlining that. But I also learned a lot about kelp. And I think, and others, the Sasarma, and looking at restoration more holistically, like from a watershed perspective, because as Jason said earlier, we know what's wrong, but how do we get from what's wrong to fixing it? And I think it really needs to have a holistic, sustainable approach, incorporating a lot of the elements that we heard here today, such as native plantings, native knowledge, and I'd love to work more closely with the tribe and strengthening the partnerships that we have and building additional partnerships, because I think we all know that's what it takes to get a restoration project over the finish line.
Beautiful. Yeah, to you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Tom Andrade, town engineer with the town of Dennis. We're very lucky here on the Cape to have agencies like the Association to Preserve Cape Cod and the Cape Cod Commission to help us identify these problems and really give the municipalities a direction. And we don't always have the resources. We certainly don't have the funds. So we look to others that know their jobs much better than we do to give us guidance. And we're very lucky to have APCC with a lot of our projects to go out and get those fundings from the different agencies. I think the big thing April said was trust, and I think that is a big thing. We're lucky that if you get to bring a good consultant on board and you do a good presentation, and you put all the thought into these projects, people respond to that. The funding agencies respond to that. So I know NOAA's been deeply involved with a lot of our projects. So thank you for that. DEP's got on board. So I think once you get that trust, that parlays over to how you reach out to the people of the community, which from the municipal side of things is always one of our biggest tasks as well. So to get to the point where we have a nice plan to go forward with the projects, now you have to reach out to the public. They want to have trust in your presentation. People like inundation models and all that stuff. It looks good up on a board, but they want to know what is happening on my property. A lot of folks have been around for a long time on Cape Cod. Certainly don't have the history that goes back to when the salt marshes were really salt marshes. But so you have to convince them that what we're doing is based on sound design, that you have confidence in your models, and that everybody's going to benefit from the projects.
Thank you very much. Are there any other reflections you'd like to share before we open it up to the audience to share some?
I just want to thank Webner for putting this together. I thought it was an excellent series of talks and presenters, starting from the very beginning. And I guess I wasn't sure what to expect, and I feel very hopeful about the future and moving forward, especially with all the knowledge and the experts that are here and working together. And I find these kind of conferences very informative so that we can share the knowledge that we have and find out about other projects that we might not have known about, like the eelgrass. I was always wondering what was going on with eelgrass, so now I know who's doing it and what they're doing a little bit more than I did before. So thank you to everyone. It's been very good, very helpful.
Thank you.
One of the other partnerships that we've had since I started working at APCC is working with the Conservation District, who's been really successful in bringing in USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service funding. So I'll say it for Martha since she's not saying it herself. But I think one of the things that we're building on, and that Sarah Grady referenced earlier with Mass Audubon's work, that Mass Marsh is working on, and Brian Yellen, is how can we work better together? How can we be more strategic? And so we have a lot of these groups, working groups, partnerships as to how to move that forward. But I think, the area that we're starting to talk about is what we're talking about here today. Where are the next sites, the strategic and most important sites to restore our rivers and bogs? Where are those next sites, or the salt marshes that have been tidally restored but are now being inundated with, ponding on the salt marsh surface? How do we prioritize where to move forward with those? And that's something we've been talking really closely with a bunch of partners, not just the district and Mass Audubon, Friends of Herring River, Center for Coastal Studies, Webner, among others, and how do we move that forward? And we're hoping to get, a partnership and funding for that. But I think even just the start of those discussions and those partnerships that already exist and the expertise we have, I see that as a place we're driving forward, and that, coming out in the next several years is really going to become more and more of an emphasis. Right now we have the project we're working on in the town of Dennis with Tom, the Weir Creek Salt Marsh Restoration. When I started that project a couple years ago, and getting some funding, it was just a simple, it was a tidal restoration. We were looking at 2 undersized culverts. Now, under my colleagues' guidance with NOAA's funding and support and other technical support, it's not just a tidal restoration with 2 undersized culverts, but removing agricultural berms within that salt marsh, removing shoaling within that creek system, working with the landowners who own those berms. Tom was at our office last week talking with one of those landowners. How do we manage that? And thinking about what is the change in the flooding, as Tom says, to their property if we're restoring not only the tidal flow there, but also creating opportunities for adaptive management with ditch management and runneling. So I think this is where, I see and find really interesting kind of like where we are, where we come from, where we're moving. When I started 10 years ago, we thought about like ditch management and maintenance with mosquito control very differently. And now we're working very kind of actively with them on some of these projects, much like they have already been doing in some of the other neighboring states. So, I think going forward, this is where we're moving, and the partnerships that we have here and the expertise, I think, is what's going to take us forward on those.
Amazing. Yes, very encouraging to hear everything that you all are saying. I mean, one of the ultimate goals of the Cape Coastal Conference has always been to bring folks together from the region in person to build those partnerships and to make these connections, because as you hear these experts speaking, like everything is interconnected and we're all working towards the same goals. But sometimes we don't know what's going on with eelgrass, and we don't know, we can't keep our finger on the pulse for everything. And so this is a nice annual time to come together and to really dedicate some focused time to advancing those partnerships and collaborating. So thank you all for being here and making this conference what it is. And I want to take some questions or comments this time from audience members, some reflections of today. If you wanted to ask any questions or build off of what anyone has said up here, I will take those now. So maybe.
Hi, Sarah Wigington from Barnstable County. We mostly do mitigation, so thinking about restoration for the first time in kind of a long time. And something that I've been thinking about in this room for the past couple of sessions is if there's any commonalities, especially early on, with a successful or maybe like less than successful restoration project. Like, do you kind of get a sense early on if it's going to work out?
So I've been doing this for about 20 years, and when we first started doing these, a lot of times this was engineering solutions. So we've got an undersized culvert. Well, the town doesn't care about a culvert being undersized. They just think you're fixing the road. This is just a DPW project. You really need to bring it back to what is the end result we're doing? What's the problem? Is it a fish run? Is it, we're trying to keep up with climate change and allow the sediment to move like we've been discussing? Is it a salt marsh restoration? And when we talk to our federal partners, they don't want to fix our local infrastructure. They want to restore. They want to build. They want to, make Cape Cod better, bring it back to maybe where it should have been before we started interfering with things. So to me, that seems to be one of the major messages. The other thing I'll say is when I started, I came from an engineering background. And for me, it was, let's get this done. Here's the project. Let's do it. You have to really work slowly and spend a lot of time in public engagement for people to understand it. In this room, we're all talking the same language. When you stand up at town meeting or if you go to a local meeting about something in their backyard, they don't understand any of that. And you really got to start slow and build momentum and build support over time. And the partnerships we have with these groups and our local land trusts and the rest are really what will get you across the finish line on those kind of things.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, public outreach is always a good thing. And I know when we do presentations, everybody's sitting in a room, they're all looking at the inundation maps and all that stuff, but you really have to bring that story back to the individual homeowners. And April brought up a meeting that we had last week, and we met with a woman and her son who owns a property that's going to be right at the beginning of the project. And they had a number of questions that I think in the public meeting they were kind of scared to ask the questions, but meeting one-on-one with each individual property owners, we met with them for about an hour, and they expressed all their concerns, and they had great questions. Very surprising, and at the end he regurgitated back to us, so what you're saying is if I put a rubber ducky out here, it's going to go up the salt marsh, and then it's going to come back out here, and you really want to get that flushing back and forth. And it came back to just a very simple analogy of a couple different things that they finally captured what we were trying to do with the project. So sometimes you have to take something that's very complicated and just break it down so it's simple for the folks who are going to be impacted the most to really get an understanding of what you're trying to do out there. And I think if you can do that, you start getting allies on your side. And now I think he knows a lot of people that live on the whole neighborhood that abut the Weir Creek. I think he's now going to be an ally for us. So I think if you can spend the time and reach out and make those connections, I think that's a good thing.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. You guys have done a terrific job doing that. I would say also for the restoration projects that we do, we work with the towns, and I found for a successful restoration project, there needs to be someone at the town level to be willing to champion that town. Otherwise, it doesn't go anywhere. And we do work with all 15 towns, so thank everyone from the town for supporting those projects. But I found that that's really what it takes.
The other thing I'll just add to, again, one of the first salt marshes I worked at was before tidal restoration, Parker's River in Yarmouth. And, I remember walking out to that site to monitor it with Brian Horsley, maybe, on some of those, if he's still here. And, we were looking at that site and we're like, oh, hey, look, here's, these ditches and look at these big piles. What is Cape Cod Mosquito Control doing? No offense to them. We love them and we work with them now quite a lot. But, we were looking at this marsh not knowing what we were seeing, which really was, as I know now, because we look at it differently now, it was an agricultural berm. It was a part of the marsh that was probably farmed for salt marsh hay, and it was a berm that was put there. Yeah, sure, mosquito control goes out and does some regular ditching to help flow, but it's a very different way of looking at a marsh. And I will say I'm not the best expert at identifying those on a smaller scale, but I think that's something that's we're learning and that has changed in how we're looking at our wetlands and our salt marshes. I think the other thing that I've kind of seen change over time, we were starting to talk about this 10 years ago, but is happening more now is what's talked about in some of these sessions today is the adaptive management piece. It's a key integral piece of some of the, ditch remediation runneling work, but I think it's something we're looking at more with some of our other projects. It's not just restore or open up that culvert and hope for the best or put in this green infrastructure and hope it's going to do what it needs to do. It requires management and maintenance. And so looking out at these sites, does it need more runneling after the fact? Coming up with a plan for that. Or at some of the sites, like, does it need planting after the fact to help boost, the trajectory of recovery? And we're doing that more now. And some of the, the largest restoration on the Cape, the Herring River Restoration out Wellfleet has a very robust adaptive management plan. So, I think we're looking at not just on the largest projects, but on kind of these varying scales of projects that kind of what's the response and what might need to be some additional adaptive management in the face of climate change.
Thank you. That was a great question with great responses. I think we might have time for one more question. I know, it was hard to follow that question. No?
Oh, thank you. Hi. I'm new at Chapter 91 in permitting, so keep that in mind. Would it be helpful? Many of these relationships and projects depend on relationships and a certain kind of capital that is not financial. Would it be helpful to have more legislation or legal agreements in place to take that burden of, the stressful interface with a private landholder, et cetera, out of the equation, and for there to be, better communication with the different municipalities on, state goals and initiatives and this holistic view?
I'll add just very quickly, I think more communication between partners, municipalities, and agencies, I think, is needed, and that is happening to some degree. There is legislation out there proposed to improve permitting. The Mass Ready Act includes some language particularly advocated for by Mass Audubon. So I think there are some of those changes, but I'm not sure kind of at a municipal level or between the municipalities and the state kind of what improvements there could be. So I'll hand it to maybe Chris or Tom if they have thoughts.
I mean, obviously, with better communication, better support is wonderful. I'll speak for a small town. We don't have a lot of staff. This is not my only job. I've got 50 other hats I wear. So sometimes that's the hardest part, is to dedicate enough time and to have enough support from all these other busy people working in the municipality so that this becomes a key project for the town. We have so many key projects that we get spread real thin, and we do rely on our partners for their expertise and their guidance on that.
Yeah, thanks. The one thing I was encouraged with is as the project got a little momentum is the team was very successful at getting some of the permitting agencies to come down and actually take a look at the job site. To sit, at an office far away and try to make judgment calls on any kind of a project is very difficult. And when you can get the folks to come down and they invest the time to come down and actually look at the project, we made a lot of progress, I think, in a couple of those site visits. So to me, the big thing is just to get the folks talking, come down and take a look at the site. A lot of the words that we heard with thin layer deposition and runnels, those were all nasty words, not too long ago. But you can see there's progress being made to try different things. I'm always pushing for a pilot project and driving April crazy with that. But I always try to get the folks down. And once they can come down and take a look at the site, I think you get a lot more recognition of the project, and I think they have a lot more appreciation of what you're trying to do. So I think that's the most important thing, is get them down to take a look at it.
And I'll just add to that, it is really important to have people come out to the site, because then they also see that you're real people too, that you're not just a piece of paper or permitting form. And that really makes a difference, making that face-to-face contact.
Thank you all very much. We are at time, so can we please thank our panelists for joining us?